to today's event on the crisis in Ethiopia. My name is Jennifer Cook. I direct the Institute for African Studies, which is housed in the Elliott School of International Affairs in George Washington University. The Institute serves as something of a hub for activities, research, discussions on African issues within the university. We see our role as connecting students, faculty, the policy community, and African institutions as well on issues of contemporary Africa. A big priority for us is to kind of elevate the and highlight African perspective, a diversity of African perspectives on contemporary issues within Africa, and to help kind of generate and expand student interest in kind of the complexity and diversity of the African continent. So we are delighted to be hosting today. I want to say welcome to the audience, to our panelists, and we're also delighted today to be partnering with two GW student organizations. One is the Ethiopia Eritrea Students Association, and I'll turn to member Emmanuel Gebeyehu in just a moment, and to the Young Black Professionals in International Affairs. So thank you to both those organizations. I'll turn to Emmanuel to say a few words of welcome. I will then introduce the panel and we'll go through presentations. We want to save ample time for question and answers. I'll explain a little bit the logistics of that. Just to say, Emmanuel came to me in spring. The association was particularly concerned about the disappearance of a number of university students. We had planned an event at that time to look at kind of the context in which that was happening. That was disrupted by COVID. We regrouped this summer, and we're really delighted that we're going forward with a kind of in-depth look at the current crisis, or perhaps crises that are kind of converging in the Ethiopian context. So Emmanuel, I turn to you for a few words of welcome, and then we'll go to the panel.
All right, welcome. My name is Emmanuel. I am a George Washington University student and a member of the Ethiopian Eritrean Student Association. I'd like to thank all of you for coming out to the Institute's event today regarding the crisis in Ethiopia. EESA believes that it's necessary to create a platform for dialogue, education, and discussion regarding the plight of our voiceless people back in Ethiopia. For instance, like Jennifer had mentioned, we did want to do something about the missing students. We had an official statement released calling for the rescue of the students back in February, and then we went ahead and tried coordinating events with the Institute. And the internationally recognized award-winning human rights activist Skundar Nega would have been our keynote speaker for this event. But unfortunately, we had to postpone the event and his travel to Washington altogether due to the coronavirus. Nonetheless, the pandemic could not stop us from hosting an event designed to educate the world on what's happening in Ethiopia. So we're very glad that this event came together. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Emmanuel. Look, now we will turn to our panelists, where we have a great set of speakers. We're going to begin with William Davison, who is a senior Ethiopia analyst in Ethiopia for International Crisis Group, longtime reporter for Bloomberg based in Ethiopia, also founder of the website Ethiopia Insight, which is a really excellent source for kind of a diversity of perspective and news on Ethiopia, which I recommend to you. We will then turn to Mr. Tewodros Abebe, who is an Ethiopian poet, writer, archivist, activist, and has been a very influential voice and voice for kind of civil dialogue within the Ethiopian diaspora community here in Washington, D.C. So welcome, Mr. Tewodros. And then we will turn to John Temin, who is Africa Director at Freedom House, longtime Africa analyst, worked in policy planning at the State Department on African issues, previously the Director for Africa at the U.S. Institute of Peace, has engaged on kind of democracy building, but also kind of the policy implications of developments in Africa for our U.S. policymaking community. Also on the line, we have Mariti Mutiga, who is Horn of Africa Project Director for Crisis Group. Mariti was ready to stand in should the internet be shut down in Addis. But Mariti, we would love to turn to you for kind of your regional perspective on in terms of what other speakers have said during the panel. And also on the line, we have the peerless Comfort Arrow, who is a director for Africa at the Crisis Group. And we would, Comfort, you're not on the formal panel, but we would love to, we hope that you will chime in where you see appropriate to get your perspective on this. Just to perhaps set the scene briefly, Prime Minister Abiy came to office in April of 2018, following years of mounting protests. His coming to office kind of unleashed this wave of optimism and euphoria, at least judging from the diaspora community here, some release of political prisoners, kind of rhetoric of political conciliation, important reforms, regional peacemaking efforts, and so forth. Really, it was quite something to behold from afar and within the diaspora community here. But there were warning signs, and there were those who were warning, beware of managing high expectations, concerned that kind of old guard EPRDF core might be backlash and pushback from there. Things have developed in a way I'm not sure that anyone fully anticipated, but we're going to hear from our panelists today. What is the state of play? What happened? What might be the way out from this current crisis? The political crisis, of course, is compounded by regional tensions over the Nile and the dam, compounded by the COVID crisis and the economic fallout from that, a postponement of national elections. So as I said, there is something of a convergence of crises happening here, and we're really turning to the analysts and experts here to kind of unpack that for us. I'm going to start with William Davidson to get us started, and then I will turn to Tewodros, John, and then Mariti, and then leaving ample time for questions and comments. So William, we'll give the floor to you and to start us off. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Jennifer, and hello to everybody who's watching. My mic's just been turned on and off. I think it's on now, right? Yeah. All right. Yes, thank you for joining. I was saying just in the sort of pre-intro that you know, I find often the audience participation section gets compressed, so I'm going to try hard just to really set the scene here and not go over like too much context, assuming that people know the broad contours of what's happened as just sketched out by Jennifer, and really look at, you know, where we've got to now, what that says about the immediate political future, where it's going, and what sort of options or what sort of possibilities that presents. But really the aim is to sort of give my view, to some extent Crisis Group's view, and then sort of try and stimulate discussion, not only about that analysis, but also about what this means going forward. So, you know, as we all know, you know, momentous political changes in 2018, Prime Minister Abiy coming to power, big changes within the ruling coalition. And this came after years of anti-government protests. And, you know, immediately there we could see the regional component to this, and regional component in the Ethiopian political context obviously also means an ethnic component or an ethno-regional component. And what I'm talking about there is a shift in power within that ruling coalition, and therefore within the federal government, from Tigray. Although I think, you know, perhaps you know, always a subject worthy of discussion, the extent of TPLF dominance within the EPRDF, but essentially a shift of power from the TPLF to those other core members of the ruling coalition, particularly Oromia. and most prominently supported by the Amhara contingent within the EPRDF. So a shift in power, but still power lying within that ruling coalition. Clearly, the idea here was to answer some of the popular demands that had been growing up for decades, not just years, but for decades in Ethiopia. We'd had years of anti-government protests, but there'd always been strong opposition to the EPRDF, its mode of governance, its concept of revolutionary democracy, and the state structure of ethnic or multinational federalism. And that was seen to be engineered and overseen by the TPLF. And essentially what we saw was we can boil it down to an anti-Tigray People's Liberation Front alliance. That also meant, an anti-authoritarian alliance, because this was, a genuinely a very authoritarian system. As mentioned briefly by Jennifer, this opened things up. I think there's plenty of room for discussion about this, but it does seem that, there's significant political changes within the ruling coalition. The removal of powerful figures and powerful networks, and reforms to legislation, the opening of the political space, that did create more opportunity for more actors, more ideologies, more ethnicities, more regions to have their say on the Ethiopian political scene, and to essentially to pursue their interests which to some degree had been suppressed during that long era running from 1991. Not that was a a uniform era. So we've had this quite tumultuous transition since then, for whatever reason. We have had huge amounts of intercommunal violence represented by huge amounts of displaced people, just as one indicator. We've had high-level political assassinations. It has not been anything like a smooth transition. And then what does this word transition mean? Generally, I think it means a transition away from authoritarianism, away from the system that the TPLF designed. And so that means a move towards democracy. And because the EPRDF acted as a sort of de facto one-party state, silencing, exiling, generally repressing and suppressing all other political opposition, this seemed to mean a move towards multi-party democracy. Formally, that's still the path that we're on. As in an election might be postponed because of COVID, but nominally it's still supposed to be a competitive election, which we certainly haven't seen since at least 2005 in Ethiopia. Therefore, giving the chance for opposition parties to be represented in parliament. That's still formally the path that we're on. I think now is appropriate to move more to the sort of, what's just happened, and what does that indicate about the situation we're in. As many of you will know, we just had another serious bout of political violence in Ethiopia. It was triggered by a murky killing of a very famous and respected, iconic Oromo cultural figure, the musician Hachalu Hundessa. That led to mass protests in Addis and Oromia, overwhelmingly from members of the Oromo ethnicity, at least to my understanding, and that spiraled into mass property destruction in Oromia, to a lesser extent in Addis, but it also was fairly widespread. Very serious bouts of intercommunal violence, reportedly mostly with Oromo protest groups attacking members of local minorities in various places in Oromia, particularly in those Rift Valley towns, Ziway, Shashamene, Arsi Negele, and yeah, something around 250 fatalities. Also, as part of this, some degree of state repression in response to these violent protests. This was not a new event during this transition. We saw a similar bout of violence in October. There was a trigger event in October. It led to protests. The protests spiraled into intercommunal violence and state violence. Why is this occurring? there's many answers to that, but at least we could see some key. We can identify some what seem like key reasons. The protests that led to the change within the EPRDF, although it was within the ruling coalition, it also involved a popular mass movement, predominantly in Oromia, but also in Amhara and other parts of the country. That Oromo protest movement was largely an Oromo, it was largely an Oromo nationalist protest movement. Yes, it talked about an anti-authoritarian struggle, anti-TPLF, but the demands were essentially aligned with the Oromo nationalist ideology. That is more autonomy for Oromia, or genuine autonomy for Oromia, a fairer economic deal for Oromia, and a fair share of representation in the federal government as they saw it. The elite Oromo opposition and also the popular Oromo protest movement, I think it is fair to say at this stage, feels that their demands, their sacrifice during that 2015 to 2018 period has not been met, has not been satisfied by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's government. Various ways to look at this, but we can look at specific demands, perhaps in terms of, Afan Oromo becoming a language of the federal government. We can also look at, harder to quantify issues like the degree of autonomy that Oromia has, or perhaps a fairer economic deal for Oromia. Also the issue of Addis Ababa's status. Whatever the details of that, one way or another, these demands have not been met. There is a great deal of dissatisfaction. And we now seem to have moved into a phase where that Oromo protest movement, largely Oromo nationalist in character, has all but given up on Abiy Ahmed's federal government. Partly, this is because of a recurrence of politicized arrests of political leaders, I should say. Whether they're politicized or not is a subjective matter, but we've seen the arrest of very influential Oromo opposition leaders, similar to what occurred during the long phase of repression of the Oromo nationalist opposition, and has led to similar complaints that legitimate political dissent is being quashed by the government. I'll try and sort of speed up quickly now and run through a few things about where this puts us and what it means for the future. I've mentioned the issue of a transition to multi-party democracy and the importance, the prominence of a competitive election in that process. Well, where are we now? The election has been suspended due to COVID-19. It's been delayed. And we've now had this bout of renewed protests, anti-government protests and violence, and the arrest of opposition leaders. The government, the federal government, the federal authorities, as we understand it, seem entirely committed to prosecuting the arrested opposition leaders. So in the best case scenario, in terms of COVID-19, let's say we had an election in May next year, 2021, or in September, October in 2021, after the main rainy season next year. Give a bit more time for the pandemic to subside. Well, is the government going to release these arrested Oromo opposition leaders in time for them to play an active, unconstrained part in an election campaign for polls potentially in those months next year? It doesn't look like it. The government seems set on prosecuting them. Whatever you think about the political, the individual Jawa, or Mohammed, or Bekele Gerba, or any of the OLF leaders, and their political ideology and their political activity, what is the perception going to be in Oromia? I would say that it's going to be quite hard now for the government, with the best will in the world, to run an election which is perceived as fair and therefore competitive and successful in terms of the outcome because of these arrests and prosecutions of Oromo opposition leaders. It's going to be a constant complaint that they were not allowed a chance to compete fairly because of these arrests. So where does that leave us in terms of the role that the election is going to play in the transition? Just to sort of pivot around a bit, the way that I've conceived this is a transition to multi-party democracy, and therefore the reform process would be a process of getting to that multi-party democracy. Maybe we're now looking at something different. I think a number of commentators have noted that, the one man left standing here is the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. His intentions seem clear. His attitude towards his opponents now seems clear. So maybe we're moving into a different type of transition. That could be the federal government trying to reassert its authority, trying to introduce some form of stability, but with quite a heavy hand, and then therefore allowing the space, as they see it, for institutional reforms, which take a number of years. Allowing those institutional reforms, whether it's democratic institutions in the judiciary, in the media, maybe constitutional reform as well, creating the space for that to occur. That, to me, now looks as likely outcome as some rapid transition to multi-party democracy. To try and bring this sort of introductory remarks to a conclusion, I imagine that there's some people, listening to me speak, who joined this call, who have very little sympathy for these arrested Oromo nationalists. And when they hear about the intercommunal violence and these genuinely horrendous attacks on local ethnic minorities across Oromia, and they hear about Oromo nationalist demands not being met by Abiy, they think, great, this is exactly what we want. And often this is linked with a political analysis of Ethiopia, that all the problems that the country is suffering, at least the political problems, rather than the sort of socioeconomic issues we could talk about, that they are at root due to ethnic or multinational federalism. Let's accept that as an argument and say that the objective of the transition now is for Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed to lead the country, perhaps to create an executive presidency, so that you have a national elected leader in some time, create the space and stability, assert law and order, the rule of law, and allow these institutional or maybe constitutional reforms to take place. Well, is Ethiopia's political situation going to allow that to occur with any degree of peace? I would suggest that the evidence that we have so far from Ethiopia's long history, its recent political history, and the reality in terms of the prominence of ethnic identity politics in Ethiopia, the fact that political and state structures, meaning the regions, are now organized formally around ethnicity, and that the idea of regional autonomy, which has a strong ethnic character to it, is again such a prominent part of the political setup that it's going to be very, very hard to move with any degree of peace into a different era without massive political problems along the way. And by that, I mean more eruptions of protests and violence, including intercommunal violence, and possibly worse to come. Why worse to come? Well, we just have to look at the Tigray situation. Again, whatever you think about the TPLF's political history and its ideology and its other characteristics, the confrontation between Tigray and the federal government, the Abiy-led federal government, is a threat to Ethiopia's state integrity, and it's a threat to the federation. That, again, whatever you think about these ideologies, that is because the TPLF are so set on defending what they see as their federation and their hard-won regional autonomy. These are the types of clashes that could occur as if the transition really changes characteristics, and we do not see some rapid transition to multi-party democracy, but instead we see Prime Minister Abiy trying to create this stability, and then Ethiopia's politics and state structure being reshaped under him. It does seem that there's going to be a major threat to Ethiopia's political stability because of the opposition to that program. That means more extreme opposition. That means more, thank you, Jennifer. That means more extreme opposition. That potentially means recurring or increased armed rebellions. And I think inevitably in the Ethiopian context, that would be met by increasing authoritarianism, which would of course be classed as a regression to authoritarianism by the federal government, which perceives itself as trying to maintain stability and to create a sort of better political system in Ethiopia. I have no idea how long I've spoken for, but I will leave it there anyway.
William made me promise I would cut him off after 10 minutes, but I just could not bring myself to do it. I don't think the participants would have forgiven me if I had cut you off at 10. Thank you very much. Really lot there and really excellent presentation. We're going to turn now to Mr. Teodros, who has something of a historical perspective on this, but as I said at this outset, also a perspective on the diaspora community, which I would be kind of interested in hearing a bit about. Mr. Teodros, I turn to you. You are unmuted.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you for that kind introduction as well. But you included activist when you introduced me. That word has lost its meaning in current Ethiopian context. So I'm not an activist really, because some of those who call themselves activists are causing a lot of pain, real pain in Ethiopia. So I'm not. Yeah. Okay. just to clear that, I'm not an activist at all. And whatever I express here is my own personal view, and I do not belong to any political party. So I just want to make clear that point. I would like to begin with expressing my heartfelt condolences to all the victims and the families of the latest round of violence in Ethiopia. These are innocent people, really, who were targeted for just being, in most cases, Amhara or Orthodox Christians. So I feel sorry that today, in 2020, in this advanced age, people resort to such gruesome acts of violence against innocent people, against really helpless people. So I really want to express my condolences to my people who lost their lives and who are still suffering under such circumstances. And Mr. Davidson's remarks compel me to reflect on my own personal life. I was born and raised in Ethiopia. Addis Ababa is my hometown. I know it very well. When I grew up, our neighborhoods, every neighborhood in Ethiopia, we have all kinds of people. Nobody cared what ethnic group one was. We had Muslim friends. We went to school. We grew up together with our Muslim friends, with people from different ethnic groups. Ethnicity really was not an issue when I grew up. It was about Ethiopianness. It was about Ethiopia. It was about unity. It was about humanity. People were not animals. In fact, it would be an insult for animals to say that, but they would not think of a fraction of what's happening today. You know, what is happening to people in Ethiopia today. I feel ashamed when I hear the news about this thing. It's very sad. No, Ethiopians, we're not like that. That's not our character. We grew up with moral values, with fear of God. We grew up loving our neighbors. Our neighbors took care of their neighbors' children. No, we don't ask what ethnicity are you from. No, we don't. That's just too low for us. But that's not the reality today, unfortunately. So I just wanted to give you my background and where I come from. So all this talk of ethnicity, I heard Mr. Davison mentioning Oromo nationalists or the leaders, and I'm sorry to hear about that, but all I hear from such people is hatred, ethnic hatred. It's very sad. That's the reality. That's what's causing so much pain to the people of Ethiopia today. And with that background, with that mentality, I mean, one of the, if you go back to history, Ethiopia's history, one special character that stands out about Ethiopians is the way they receive others with an open heart and with open hands. From people, explorers or travelers, they come to Ethiopia. But of course, Ethiopians are very, very serious about their identity, about the integrity of their territorial integrity of their country. But they are welcoming people, even from outside of Ethiopia. Today, moving from one part of Ethiopia to another is a huge risk. How did we get here? It was not like that. In Ethiopia, there's an expression. We say it in Amharic, Langada. Beit Langada means the house belongs to the stranger who's visiting, or someone who might be traveling and, well, it gets dark and he wants to stay somewhere, and someone in the neighborhood will allow him, come on in. They will feed him, he will spend the night, then he will start his trip the next day. It's that type of culture we come from. How did we lose it? How did we start gruesomely killing people like that? It's very sad. For me, the root cause of all this problem is ethnic federalism that we've been witnessing the past 30 years. For 30 years, EPLF, EPRDF, that's what's happening for 30 years. This generation today, the generation that is killing, burning, looting, even in foreign lands, we're seeing, members who are believing in that type of ideology, destroying statues, as we saw in London a few weeks ago. This is just a public park in London, and thugs who follow the activists that Mr. Davison mentioned. They went to that public park in London and destroyed Emperor Haile Selassie's statue. And the statue, and even the park guide and the map, you don't do that. How can people be so uncivilized, even living in a civilized world? So the cause of all this is ethnic federalism, ethnicism, poisonous ethnicism that has been fed to the generation for 3 decades, for 30 years. Now we're seeing the result of that reality. That's the root cause of the problem. The root cause really goes to the Constitution, the 1994 Constitution, after the EPRDF came to power. That needs to be amended. So Ethiopia has become a nation that is defined by ethnicity. That was not the case before EPRDF. So that poison, which they spread throughout the nation, has made the nation sick, very sick, as we see it today. So all this Oromo nationalism, everything that Mr. Davison mentioned, is something artificial that was created intentionally to weaken the state of Ethiopia, Ethiopia's unity. So we have to recognize that fact. And of course, when we see what the government of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed is doing, yes, they brought, when he came to power, he brought so much hope. There was euphoria. Yes, I wrote about it as well. Everybody was happy because the name Ethiopia and the concept Ethiopianism was being killed during the previous regime. So he came back and he started glorifying Ethiopia, Ethiopia's history, Ethiopian nationalism. And we were very happy. But one problem I have with Mr. Abiy, Prime Minister Abiy, is that he was not being firm, or well, until recently, about these destructive elements. There was no accountability in Ethiopia. There was no rule of law, really. It was a mob rule, and everybody was doing whatever, the killings and everything. The government did not do enough. That's what makes me sad on one side. So I'm sorry, you wanted to say something, Ms. Cook?
No, I think maybe finish this and move to our next speaker and come back in the question and answer. First of all, I want to say thank you for kind of expressing the pain of watching this unfold. I mean, a couple of things, this is there are humans at the heart of this that we should not forget. The second is this notion of kind of ethnicity as mobilized and intensified, in Ethiopia's case, institutionalized, which makes it then very hard to unravel and used by politicians. Adding to that, in this day of internet and social media, is kind of the polarization of discourse that happens online, and that overlay that some really ugly rhetoric online is happening as well, and it kind of all feeds into what is already an institutionalized and an instrumentalized problem. So thank you, Mr. Tewodros, for that intervention. Let's turn to John Temin of Freedom House. John wrote last year, I guess it was, on this euphoria surrounding Abiy's reforms, but kind of outlined a number of things to watch and be wary of. So, John, I want to turn to you. What happened, and perhaps also kind of from a policy perspective, what that. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Jennifer. And thanks to GW and to the Students Association for having me. Let me say I'm very much a third wheel here because Will's analysis is really trusted very much by me and so many others. And so it's great to hear from him. And Dr. Tewodros obviously makes some very important points. I look forward to hearing more of those. But yes, so last year, my colleague Yosef Wadwaza and I wrote an article in the Journal of Democracy that laid out a lot of the real tangible improvements in terms of freedoms and at least some movement towards democracy that the Prime Minister brought in his first year and a half in office. And it is important to remember those things are real, and some of them are still impactful. And in some ways, Ethiopians are significantly more free now than they were under the Meles regime. Just as one measure in Freedom House's annual Freedom in the World ratings, Ethiopia has had two of the largest ratings gains in the world these last couple of years. Now we'll see what happens when we do that again in January, because there might be some regression. So amidst all the negativity, and there's a lot of negative right now, I just think it's important to remember too that a lot of Ethiopians on a daily basis are enjoying more freedoms than they have for a long time. But to the question of where things have gone awry, I'd point to a few specific themes. One is the return of some of the tools of repression from the previous regime. Things like the hate speech law that is in place right now is not an improvement, whereas some of the other pieces of legislation are improvements over previous pieces. The anti-terrorism legislation is being used again in pretty nefarious ways, and that's something that many of us hoped was a thing of the past. The Prime Minister's new Prosperity Party is using state resources pretty clearly in the interests of the party and perhaps himself and not the country. Another theme has been the Prime Minister and his government's struggles with communication, which is somewhat surprising given that he, on an individual level, seems to be a pretty good communicator. But they've really struggled to outline what is the big picture plan beyond the high profile one-off moves that he does that get a lot of media attention. Where is this country going? What is his plan? That gets to a lot of these questions about constitutional reform and the structure of the state, which Ethiopians have very strong feelings about. And related to that, there's really been too much focus by the Prime Minister on some of these vanity projects, things like the greening of Addis Ababa, which of course is important in itself, but probably distracts from some of the bigger picture forces at play that are driving some of the instability now. And even some of what the Prime Minister has done beyond his borders in terms of mediation now feels pretty extraneous given what's happening domestically. He's been involved in peacemaking in South Sudan and dabbled in peacemaking between Kenya and Somalia. Those things now seem like a diversion of his time. And then one other mistake, I think, was on the renewal of his mandate. When COVID erupted and it became clear that elections needed to be postponed, it was a pretty quick and closed process that led to the extension of his time in office, which would have expired in September. That was a missed opportunity to have a real dialogue with the opposition and to really talk together about how to confront this massive challenge in coronavirus and how to most likely extend his time in a way that is broadly agreeable as opposed to the way that it happened. But let me say there are some reasons for optimism here amidst a lot of negativity right now. And I think one great source of that is actually Ethiopian public opinion. And I say that based on some data. And this is some new information here. Many folks, I'm sure, are familiar with the Afrobarometer, which is really the gold standard in terms of public opinion survey work across Africa. They did an Ethiopia survey. The work was done in December of last year, January of this year. And just now the findings are starting to come out. My organization, Freedom House, supported that survey, helped to craft some of the questions. So I have a bit of early access to the findings. Those findings are going to be released in the coming weeks. So many folks will start to see them. But let me just share a few quick things, which is that there's really strong and deep popular support for democracy, rule of law, and elections. A large majority of Ethiopians, 90% on the whole, support democracy. And a large majority reject non-democratic regimes. 77% reject one-party rule. 76% reject military rule. One-man rule is rejected by 84% of respondents. There's also strong support for rule of law. 68% say the Prime Minister must always obey the laws in the courts, even if he thinks they are wrong. 86% say that any government, no matter how popular it is, must always follow the law. And finally, on elections, 84% say that regular, open, and honest elections are the best way to choose their leader. So there is a strong foundation of support for a move towards democracy and towards rule of law, and that's something to build on. And that's something that's found in a lot of countries, but certainly not all countries. So for me, that is one source of optimism. I will temper that optimism, though, because one of the strong findings I see in the survey is limited trust amongst people. And I think that has a lot to do with some of the instability that we're seeing right now. There's this one question in the survey that says, generally speaking, would you say that most people can be trusted or that you must be very candid in dealing with people? 80% said you must be very careful in dealing with people. Sorry, I misspoke earlier. It's careful with people. So 80% of respondents say you must be very careful with people. That goes to a lack of trust between citizens that is concerning. So what am I watching for in terms of benchmarks and signals of where things are going? Will touched on a few of them. One is developments within Oromo political parties, which is driving a lot of the instability right now. Another is the standoff with the TPLF, which is planning to have their own elections pretty soon, which is going to be quite divisive if that goes through. Another we haven't talked about yet is what's going on in the South. Recently, there was creation of a new federal member state in Sidama. That process actually went relatively well compared to some concerns. But there are also concerns that that's going to lead to additional demands for secession and for the creation of new states, which may not necessarily be a bad thing, but it can be a volatile process. And of course, the two really existential issues that I think we're all watching. One being elections, as Will talked about. This is the test of the Prime Minister's commitment to democracy as a whole. One of those Afrobarometer findings was low trust in some of the institutions that are supposed to be running elections, such as the Electoral Commission, so that's concerning. Second is the future of ethnic federalism and the constitution making or revising process. Some of the Afrobarometer findings suggest pretty strong support for ethnic federalism as a whole, but a real desire to edit the process and to reform the process of ethnic federalism, but not to do away with it entirely. What's so important there is the process, and we all get wrapped up in what's the outcome of such processes and what kind of structure is it going to be. What too often gets lost in so many countries is what is the process that a country goes through to have that nationwide conversation and to make sure that so many voices are included. And I hope that's a big part of the conversation when that conversation really becomes active in Ethiopia. So finally, Jennifer, you suggested making a few comments on policy, and a lot of what I do is comment on US policy, so I'll do that here. The first one is the case of Ethiopia really shines a light again on the struggles of the US government to surge support and really pivot quickly towards states that are changing and reforming, as Ethiopia at least was a couple years ago. The support has been slow, the money has been slow, the bureaucratic mechanisms are slow. And so many people continue to work on this, but Ethiopia suggests there's still a lot more work to do. What's happening over the border in Sudan suggests the same. Second is that it's so important to focus on institutions and not on individuals. And I think many of us have gotten wrapped up in Abiy and many of the things he did early on and the cult of personality and the Nobel Prize winning and so forth. But he can be gone tomorrow. The institutions are not going anywhere. And that's why so much of our diplomacy, so much of our development assistance continues to need to focus on those institutions, whether it's the Parliament or the Electoral Commission or the Human Rights Commission or other things. Related to that is how important it is to reform legislation, because those pieces of legislation are the rules of the game. And yes, they can be changed, but for the most part, they tend to stick around for a while. There's been some good reform to that legislation, particularly early on, but that has slowed, if not reversed. Final point, we haven't talked a lot about the GERD, the Grand Ethiopia Renaissance Dam, which of course threatens, it may be unlikely, but threatens a regional conflict with Egypt in particular. Many folks will have seen this new reporting that the US is considering withholding development assistance to Ethiopia. If Ethiopian position on this doesn't change, that is a hugely unhelpful potential step by the US. I don't know how likely it is, but really all that would do is just limit US engagement with Ethiopia, and it would further ingrain a sense that the US is taking Egypt's side in this conflict, and there's already some evidence to suggest that there's some truth to that. So I certainly hope that doesn't come to reality. I'll stop there, look forward to some questions and to continuing to learn from my fellow panelists.
So I'm going to turn to Mariti, and as I said at the outset, Comfort, if you want to chime in, please do. To participants, we ask that you submit your questions and comments into the chat, and we will then draw on that to put questions to the panelists. So do use that. Mariti.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jennifer. As you said, I wasn't going to speak, actually. I was only going to speak if Will was not able to. But I'll just give a very quick take from the region. One is that historically, Ethiopia has been seen, as some sort of status quo power. When you looked at it from outside, it may have its internal contradictions, but was unlikely to be a source of instability within the region. Now people worry when they look at this giant of the Horn, second largest in terms of population country on the continent. People worry about how it will resolve the very significant challenges it is going through now. Just a quick anecdote. An Ethiopian official told us about speaking to a Kenyan, high-ranking figure, and then they said, we want to discuss the dam. And the Kenyan retorted, listen, that's really, really important, but we consider Ethiopia as the giant dam of the region. I hope your banks are not going to break and submerge us all. So that's how people view it. People really would like to see this resolved in a way that's consensual, in a way that potentially includes an elite bargain and a comprehensive agreement, hopefully through a national dialogue that at least allows people to live at peace. And I take all the comments that have come before very seriously, but we hope that some sort of bargain can be struck. So the only other two things are, one, there are serious ideological issues at play that whose resolution, especially in Ethiopia and Sudan, will have implications, not just for the region, but perhaps even for the continent. So just two things. One is the right balance of power between the center and the periphery, or the provinces, or whatever you call them in any of those contexts. I think this is a debate that matters not just for Ethiopia, but for Sudan as well, potentially for South Sudan, for many East African countries. I think there's a lot riding on the question of what model works best. Secondly, it's the question of the mode of governance. There is very serious differences between those like Isaiah's in Eritrea that believe that you need an authoritarian approach to governance to be able to stabilize these very complex countries. But there's also a very significant countercurrent that says in very diverse countries, in countries where the population, as we saw in Sudan, has developed an appetite for more representative democracy, in places like Ethiopia, where people demand a greater say, including at the local level, democracy works best. We are watching those debates very keenly from outside Ethiopia. The way they will be resolved will have a lot of implications. And all I would say is, I look forward to hearing from the rest of the panelists, but also from the participants, what their views are on those key issues.
Great. Thank you, Mariti. Comfort, if you'd like to say something, please chime in. We just want to take full advantage of you being here, but you're not obliged. Okay. You can always come back to make a comment as we go along. So I think what we'll do now is we have some good time for kind of questions and comments from our audience. I want to turn first to Emmanuel for kind of the first question to the panelists or follow-up comment. Then we'll open it up for broader discussion.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer, and thank you to all the panelists for your analysis and views on the situation. And again, thank you for coming. To open our Q&A, I'd like to preface with some comments and a question. Since the goal of our event is to understand what's happening in Ethiopia, I would like to speak to the international community on what I perceive as early signs of a large-scale ethno-religious genocide in Ethiopia. My following points are substantiated by Crisis Group, Minority Rights Group International, The Washington Post, and other verifiable sources of information. First, I would like to define the radical youth that was mentioned by William and Mr. Tedros, and that would be the Ero. And the Ero are a self-identifying and informally organized mobs of Oromo youth. But the definition of Ero in the Oromo language is youth. However, when we refer to the Ero, the connotation refers to the organized mobs, not the dictionary definition. And the Ero mobs do not represent the Oromo people. They are a minority of extremist elements that are terrorizing Ethiopia by killing innocent people based on ethnicity and religion. Ethnically, the targets were non-Oromos, mainly Amharas and Gurages, and religiously the targets were Orthodox Christians. And it's important to note that even Oromo Orthodox Christians were among those slayed because of their religion. The killings were not random, but they were based solely upon identity. People were specifically handpicked to die because of their ethnicity and their religion. And the ways that these people died were very brutal, such as through beheadings, mutilations, their eyes being ripped out, being hung, and their dead bodies being dragged on the streets. And following the death of Hachalu Hundessa, early figures showed that 239 people died in Ethiopia, but it is believed to be even higher now. In terms of property damage and displacements, hotels, schools, businesses, residential homes, and churches were looted and burned like arrows on the basis of identity. People have nowhere to go, they've lost their homes, businesses, livelihoods, and their loved ones, and are still grieving now. Thousands have been displaced, and many have taken refuge in churches and mosques. But however, the internet's return has brought out individual stories that can be released upon request through video. These were premeditated and planned, as arrows had lists of names and households to target. They went door to door and checked ethnicities on ID cards before attacking. And the arrows, according to reports, were not locals, but were outsiders moving between towns. Regarding the government, both the federal and local governments did not intervene to help these people, and they even joined the arrows in some instances. In the town of Dera, security forces stood and watched a son lose his father, but they claimed they couldn't step in. However, when victims did try to defend themselves, the Oromia region security forces instead attacked them. So this shows that the Ethiopian people are vulnerable, scared, and defenseless because they have no security or protection by their government. And I will conclude now and ask my question. This is not Ethiopia's first ethno-religious massacre. The exact same events transpired in the October 2019 massacre and the September 2018 Burayu massacre. Given the repeating and worsening pattern of ethno-religious massacres in Ethiopia under Abiy Ahmed, there is an alarmingly increasing risk of a full-scale genocide if the international community does not step in, because the government is unwilling to protect people or prevent future massacres due to complicity and involvement in the massacres that took place. So John Temin, my question is directed to you. As you have extensive policy background and experience, through what policy avenues can we call on the United Nations Office of Genocide Prevention and Responsibility to Protect to open an investigation to call for an early warning and prevention of ethno-religious genocide in Ethiopia? Thank you.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Let's maybe get some first responses, perhaps from John Temin. That was directed at you. I'd like to turn to William. I mean, in terms of the genocide is a big word to be, I think we want to understand the nuances of the situation. John, why don't you respond, and we'll turn to William for a quick response.
Sure. I mean, there's a lot packed in there, and my fellow panelists are better at addressing much of it. But in terms of the international piece and raising awareness, my concern would be less about raising awareness than it is about building political will to do something. I think often that there's a lot of focus on awareness raising and early warning, but even if the early warning comes, there's less of a focus on what can we honestly do about it. I think the people who pay attention to the world are paying attention to Ethiopia. This is not a small, insignificant country for all the reasons that everybody here knows. The U.S. is significantly invested here. This is in a part of the world that the U.S. and a lot of others care about and pay close attention to. So I would focus more of the attention and the question on how do we build political pressure, whether it's in the US or Europe or elsewhere, to meaningfully respond to these threats if they are as you see them? And how do we help governments to shape their response to these threats? And those are tough questions that don't have easy answers. And particularly at a time of coronavirus, a lot of people are looking inward. But my advice, less would be to focus less on getting the attention of one particular person at the UN, particularly given dysfunctionality within the UN, and more about how can we get some of the key national governments, not just in the West, in Africa, perhaps in China too, to pay attention and to really shape their policy options in response to the threats that you are describing.
Thank you. William, William, I wonder if you would like to comment, because I think there's a couple of questions in the comment section on kind of the potential for this to morph into something much more widespread and systematic, if you will.
Yeah, sure. I mean, sorry, the lights just went out here, so I probably look a bit strange right now. So I'm not sure that it's a productive use of anyone's time at this stage to be starting to talk about, what can the UN do to prevent genocide, and to be describing this this systemic problem of political violence, which involves undoubtedly attacks on ethnic minorities as impending genocide. That's not to say that that risk doesn't exist, but I'm just not sure that it's a constructive approach to focus on that during a discussion like this, or indeed during any political discussion. What I mean by that, and what I tried to sketch out in my introductory remarks, is that we are dealing with a political problem here. And as I move through this, I hope to respond to some of the things that Todra said, some of the things that were said by that were asked by in the question from Dame Orma. Also, this is a political problem, and if we think about some of the key elements of that, and elements that repeat across the world, I think that political polarization is a massive problem in Ethiopia. That also seems to be widely acknowledged and understood. It's polarization, yes, based around political ideology, played out along ethnic, religious, regional lines, and something which is also to some worrying degree exacerbated by social media. When addressing Ethiopia's political problems, analyzing them, and thinking about what we can do about them, I struggle to see how adopting a polarizing position on that is taking the country forwards. Yes, some of the Oromo protest movement is known as Kero. What exactly a Kero is not entirely clear. The label exists, it can be applied. Some of those Oromo protesters, some of which who are called Kero, have engaged in property destruction and targeted ethnic attacks. That does not necessarily characterize by any means the entirety of the Oromo nationalist movement. By labeling the movement as such and essentially deflecting from Ethiopia's core political questions and stereotyping that entire movement as consisting of people who are engaged in those type of ethnic-based attacks which may lead to genocide, I would argue that it's adding to Ethiopia's political polarization, and it's the polarization that is making it so hard to see some sort of consensual solution, which my colleague Murati spoke of, in terms of a grand bargain. Instead, I think we have to focus on the core political problems. And here I would move to some of the comments by Theodorus. Obviously, he is a sincere opponent of ethnic federalism, and many opponents of ethnic federalism have very strong arguments. Is it correct to present the political eras before ethnic federalism as maybe not an ideal, but something which was significantly better for the majority of Ethiopian people? It seems to be a factual matter that the Derg era and the imperial era that preceded it were also exclusionary political moments, and that in many ways the EPRDF era built upon that. And what we are trying to do is move away from that type of exclusionary politics. If we move away from that type of exclusionary politics, It means that we are moving away from the political polarization that seems to be feeding this type of political violence that is ending in the ethnic-based attacks, which people are labeling impending genocide. Again, I am not sure that this is a constructive way of conceiving Ethiopia's political problems and of sketching out a path forward. And I would ask all of our contributors to try and think about how they can modify those polarized analyses and focus on the political moment that we have now and what is the constructive path forward. And here I would move to the question that was asked, sorry, I'm struggling with names here, by Dame Orma, I believe. What are we to do, the international community? What advice do we give to Prime Minister Abiy? Well, I think in line with Dame's, what seems to be implied in Dame's question, at Crisis Group, we do not believe that the trajectory that the Prime Minister is on and his government is on is the best way to move Ethiopia out of this exclusionary politics. As much as people might have sincere opposition to the ideology behind ethnic federalism and despise the structures and the segregation and the divisiveness that they believe it has created in Ethiopia, it is a political reality. Oromia region, Oromo nationalism, and the figures and the movements that are behind that are major political players in Ethiopia. If you try and go too hard in terms of reform, along with your own ideals and your own ideology, and you ignore those elements, it suggests to me that we are going to have continuing political instability in Ethiopia. What I'm getting at here is, again, what my colleague Murati referred to. Given the political problems that are now seem ingrained in this transition, what we need is for some form of comprehensive political negotiation. Yes, an elite bargain, but also something which brings together all strands of Ethiopian society to discuss these issues over history, to discuss these clashing ideologies, to discuss the growing interreligious and inter-ethnic problems. Because unless we have that sort of participatory, inclusive approach where we embrace political opponents in line with the Prime Minister's Medema ideology, then it seems that we are destined for more political violence, more state authoritarianism in response, and continuing these exclusionary political practices which Ethiopia has suffered from and which has led in one way or another to the type of violence that the speakers are objecting to so strongly.
William, thank you very much. And I mean, it is a reminder, we need to be very careful with the language we use, the framing, the analysis, the analytic approach to this. There are many competing narratives out there on the internet. There are kind of inflammatory characterizations of one side or the other that I don't think brings us any further. We have some questions in the comment section about, you're not representing X view or X view or X view. It is very hard to have every view represented. But I do think we want to stay with the core of kind of analysis and constructive critique and conversation. Siaka, I'm going to turn to you. There are questions and comments. Perhaps you can draw out a few of those. Yeah, you're more adept than I, then
yes.
read them to the panelists. Thank you, William.
Yes. We have a question, two-part question here from Ade Tefera. In terms of the opposition leaders who are relying on ethnically and racially charged rhetoric to gather support against Prime Minister Abiy, one could argue that the disruptive rhetoric is as strong as the individuals who believe in it. Question number one, what would you say regarding the blowback that Oromo, the ethnic group, has received Sorry, another question came and pushed that up, but let me go back. What would you say regarding the blowback that Oromo, the ethnic group, is receiving from the actions of disruptors who are responsible for the crisis in the name of Oromia? And two, where is public discourse on Ethiopia regarding the crisis? Um, where is the public discourse in Ethiopia regarding the crisis? Is the Oromia population being held accountable for the actions of disruptors who act in the name of Oromia? And that's for anyone to take. I would say that's directed to Tewodros, actually. Mr. Tewodros, I will unmute you.
Sure. Thank you. First, let me make this term that has been repeated many times. What is political violence? Maybe I have misunderstood it, but what does political violence to do with burning a church, for example? We've seen it many times in the past couple of years, and recently, in the past year. Many Orthodox Christian churches have been burned down. What does political violence have to do with that? That's the essence of the problem is, again, the system, this federalism or the ethnic politics that has been promoted vigorously the past 3 decades. Well, the Ethiopian people have been, in general, have been victims of undemocratic systems. All of them. Well, Emperor Haile Selassie's regime was mentioned. For all the faults it had, for all its weaknesses, the emperor and his government were truly visionaries. They've done a lot to promote Ethiopia, not only Ethiopia, to promote Africa and the African interest. But he never, someone can argue with me for days, but he never divided people ethnically. I can argue on that point with anyone who chooses to argue. Again, let's go to then let's talk about the military regime under Colonel Mengistu Haile Mariam. For all its crimes, for all its weaknesses, the regime never focused on ethnic identity. We cannot accuse of that Mengistu's regime for being ethnically centered. No. So the problem again is yes, there are elements that there have been elements who wanted to weaken Ethiopia for. I mean, it's not new to us. It's been throughout our history, a long history. Yes, there have been elements, not new, but the past 3 decades, again, 30 years, the generation has been fed ethnic hatred, and we're seeing the results of that. So the government, Abiy government, in my view, as with all its best intentions, have been compromised with those who entered the country with evil agendas. Let's not hide the fact that the youth that is causing so much destruction in Ethiopia is being assisted from outside with media media that really promote ethnic violence.
Thank you.
So we have to consider all these facts. Thank you, Jeff. Sorry.
Thank you.
Thank
We
you.
did yeah.
We have a question from Ambassador Muramula, and it's for all panelists. Her question is as follows. Do you see any role of the African Union in both situations, including the standoff on the mega dam with Egypt and Sudan? And this is for any panelist.
Yes, I could take that and answer quickly. I mean, it's a pretty quick answer. The African Union is integrally involved in the negotiations over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. That occurred after Egypt took the issue to the UN Security Council. I think the AU was late standing up, but they stood up. They've taken on a role. They're facilitating negotiations. They've ensured that Sudan and Egypt have maintained negotiating, despite Ethiopia beginning to fill the dam without an agreement. Talks resumed today after that potential crisis point was avoided, largely because of the AU intervention. Their legal experts are on the case, offering compromise solutions, along notably with the Sudanese government. It's an excellent development that the AU and its member states have taken on this role in the negotiations. And although there is much still to do in terms of ironing out the remaining issues, it's looking a lot more promising than it was, let's say, 1 month ago.
William, if I could just come back to you, because there's a question kind of, if you could, and you alluded to this in your opening, but kind of the immediate steps that you advise the Prime Minister to take in terms of kind of navigating out of this. I'd also like to add to this kind of what the economic kind of downturn is adding to this and how much of a factor that might be, and how much of a factor kind of economic recovery and growth, which the Prime Minister has also made a priority private sector, may be in terms of kind of allaying some of the regional political tensions there. Yeah,
sure. Maybe my rather long rambling answer, but the point got lost. But it's negotiations. The political trajectory that the federal government appears to be on is what I sketched out in the intro, which is that the Prime Minister oversees the transition, tries to create some form of law and order and political stability, mainly, well, partly by acting against political opponents, therefore, creating the space in their vision, as I understand it, for these institutional, maybe even constitutional reforms to take place. Given Ethiopia's political history, its situation, the moment we're in, the nature of the opposition, that does not seem to be a sustainable path if the objective is to have a relatively peaceful transition. Instead, the time seems to be to admit that the transition is not going well, that a election is not necessarily going to even solve this because of the political conditions that exist, and instead these very fundamental fault lines that run throughout Ethiopian politics and have all these horrific effects, these downstream effects that the participants have accurately described. The way to try and ease those tensions, the way to try and achieve some form of political consensus is through negotiations. It's not going to be easy. The polarization exists. It exists for a reason. People disagree. But that's why they need to start talking now and start trying to reach compromises. In terms of the economic situation, I think it is difficult to have a really positive outlook for various reasons. I haven't got time to go into that now, but we're essentially in some form of economic transition as well. I think the government acknowledges, the international institutions acknowledge that's going to lead to some significant drop-off in GDP growth over the next few years. This means fewer jobs for Ethiopians. There's about, 2-3 million Ethiopians hitting the labor market each year. We already have a huge youth bulge. We already have very large unemployment and underemployment. Unfortunately, that creates, let's say, willing volunteers or the potential for these political entrepreneurs, including the ethnic political entrepreneurs, to mobilize people, to instrumentalize people in pursuit of their own political objectives. The worse the economic situation the worse the economic situation gets, and the outlook does not look good, the larger pool of potential recruits for this political movements they are. Therefore, it's going to feed back into Ethiopia's very volatile political situation. So the economic element is indeed a major issue, and unfortunately, the prospects do not look good. This is another reason to begin political negotiations and try and lower the tensions as soon as possible.
You mentioned the African Union role on the dam. In terms of regional or African Union pressures on the Abiy government in reaching out, in beginning those negotiations, in considering releasing the Oromo opposition leaders in the run-up to the elections, have you seen much kind of continental regional push?
Let's say there's some sort of stirrings from inside the machine. I think many regional actors, African actors, international actors share crisis groups' analysis, many other people's analysis about the volatility of this situation. They are very aware of Ethiopia's importance and just the human tragedy that would be involved in any deterioration, significant deterioration of the Ethiopian political situation. They are aware, they are looking for ways to help. Of course, it's a hugely sensitive matter. No government, no state is willingly going to, or is going to be really enthusiastic about inviting external actors to meddle in their internal affairs. But as we all know, the situation is very grave, and the African Union and other international actors are fully aware of that.
Okay, thank you. Siaka, any final questions from the group?
Let's see here. I think William did a great job in answering several questions in one concerning youth unemployment and the likes. I had one here. How can we reconcile, and this is from Joanna Spears, for any panelists, how can we reconcile the desire for democracy with the fact that much is organized ethnically? Uganda always uses this as an argument for not having elections. How can we have democracy that does not deepen into ethnic divides?
John, do you want to tackle that one? Rwanda has Rwanda, for example, has forbidden the use of ethnicity in public parlance. How do you get the balance?
Yeah, I mean, you can say ethnicity is forbidden. I'm very skeptical that's ever truly going to be the reality. You know, it's not for me to recommend which type of political system is right for Ethiopia, but I would go back to the point I made about the process for having that conversation, which I think is so important. You know, when the time for constitutional reform comes, how are Ethiopians going to have a voice in that process? How is that going to be an inclusive process? So there is some degree of satisfaction that the outcome is satisfactory to at least a majority of the population. Many are probably not going to be happy with it, and there is a pretty distinct divide between those who want to stick with ethnic federalism in various forms versus what seems like a smaller group that wants to move towards a more unitary system. You know, this is the existential question for Ethiopia right now. What is the timing of this process, and how is it going to run, and ultimately, what's the outcome? That's where I think a lot of the conversation should be right now, beyond the obviously urgent issues of the day.
Great. Thank you. We are just about at time. I wanted to turn to Mariti, Teodros, and William to see if you have any kind of final wrap-up comments. Keeping it very brief, we're really almost at time here. Teodros, do you want to say just a couple words, wrap up? I'm going to unmute you. Oops, Siaka, can you unmute? Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, can you hear me? Yes. Thank you. First, again, thank you for organizing discussion. It's a very important discussion, and I'm sure we'll continue the dialogue. And one point I want to make is that Ethiopians mostly are of mixed ethnicity. Really, we're just people who are with a different background, ethnic or religious background, and we've lived like that for centuries. And we're to close with a bright note. I think that Ethiopian character of resilience and love and faith will overcome the current turmoil, and Ethiopia will be back to its strong side. Thank you.
Thank you, Frederick. Mariti, any final thoughts?
Yeah, no, just very quickly, I think one of the things to say about when you watch the Ethiopian debate is a crisis of empathy. I think it would be very important for all sides to recognize that, it's not a black and white issue. It's possible to see the merits of avoiding homogenization, giving more cultural rights to various groups, while also seeing the demerits and potential weakening effects of some of the systems that have been introduced in the past. So I would say that if more and more people can appreciate each other's viewpoints, it's very difficult, but I think at a time like this, striking a bargain that is accommodative rather than exclusionary will be better for Ethiopia.
Thank you, very well said. William, we can't see your face, perhaps a last word, and we will wrap up. We give as someone based in Addis right now.
Well, I think I've had plenty of opportunity to speak. To be honest, I think Mariti put it very, very well. But I think with any kind of like what we a polarized political debate or somewhat bitter political debate, I think yes, absolutely what Mariti said in terms of empathy, but then sort of almost like more practically, more mechanically, as much as people can appreciate the political reality that exists, and then focus on what are the possible steps to a better future, the better. I think the more time people spend on the grievances of the past, legitimate as they are, and as important as they are for informing the present, ultimately that's not going to be enough to build a better future. You also have to acknowledge the political reality that exists and then look at practical steps forward. And I think really that's what we need to see more of in this sort of, this broad debate that we have about Ethiopia's troubled political situation.
Thank you. Excellent comments to wrap up on. Keeping it practical, keeping it analytic, retaining our empathy, and listening to the various perspectives. I know that this won't be our last discussion on Ethiopia. I just want to say a big thank you to our panelists, to Crisis Group for being so well represented and speaking so well, John, Mr. Tewodros, and to Emmanuel and the Ethiopian Eritrean Students Association, and to our audience. Thank you all very much. We look forward to kind of continuing, as I said, and to future sessions and events. And with that, we will sign off. So big thank you to all of you. Take care.
Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, William.